Chapter 55. The cursed seal markings hadn't even finished etching themselves across the Sound Shinobi's skin, taking on a burning crimson hue as his flesh was dyed orange, before the chamber exploded into conflict and set the tone of the battle. The stout shinobi extended his hand towards Kiba, who had cut off his attempt to get through to wherever the door behind him led, and the ground beneath the ladder erupted in response. It was a seal-less offensive technique that caused stone lances to sprout from beneath Kiba and gouged out his heart. Or would have, if his ears, that hadn't been one of the senses, sharpened to the limit through his clan's hidden technique. The moment he heard the earth shifting beneath his feet due to the rock pillar spears technique, he'd moved. It was done in haste, a messy side roll, while cradling Akamaru tucked inside his clothes, and Kiba was left sucking in a sharp breath as pain registered in the form of stinging heat running across his chest as he came out of the roll. Scraps of torn cloth and blood marked the space traveled. The bloodied tip had gotten a decent scrape in, piercing the outer layer of skin as he moved. It drew a rough line in his exposed flesh and had nearly gotten Akamaru too. The near kill within a second left him grimacing as Rock Lee got to the Earth user's backside, his feet off the ground with one chambered to deliver a devastating aerial kick. The blow came around hard and fast. It struck the back of the skull with what should have been enough force to at least bring him to his knees, if not cave in his skull. Yet, the kick did nothing as the now demonic-looking shinobi twisted his upper body with his elbow, extended faster than his size would leave one to believe possible. Bringing both his arms up to act as a shield, Lee was still left wide-eyed and gritting his teeth as it drove him across the room. He barely managed to brace himself before he ended up hitting the wall and landing in a crouch. Then Hinata nearly got crushed as Jirobo grabbed a flat slab of stone he'd raised from the ground with a stomp to stop her from reaching Naruto. Digging his fingers into the solid stone, he swung it around his body to force her to back off and then flung it towards her as though it were a tile. There was a thunderous crash as stone dust obscured the Hyuga heiress from view until she stumbled out, her pale skin nursing slight lacerations from where shrapnel from the collision tore at it. Anger tamped down on whatever fear or hesitation could be found in the Inuzuka as his lips pulled back to reveal lengthened canines. Chakra rolled off his body as he went into his four legs technique, making it so that his body could move at full effectiveness on all fours. Then that chakra sank into his body as they went on the offense. "Let's go, Akamaru." With a bark, Akamaru clambered to the top of his head and synchronized the chakra within his tiny body to Kiba's, allowing the latter to shape it through the tiger seal. With a puff of smoke and displacement, the former took on the latter's shape. The transformed hound then jumped off his back to the left, while Kiba darted to the right, circling around and closing the distance with superhuman bounds. Elongated nails turned into claws and then flashed from the right and left as the Inuzuka pair unleashed their pincer attack. One pair to tear out the throat. One pair to disemboweled. Both fell short within centimeters of ripping Naruto apart as the Sound Shinobi held his unconscious body out to stop them before he slammed his other hand into the ground and twisted it. The sound of shifting earth drove both to move or die once more. The pair pushed off the ground to the left and right, spiraling to the walls and clinging to the vertical surface using chakra on their hands and feet as a booming crash was followed by a spray of gravel. They'd barely made it in time to avoid the snare that he'd turned the ground beneath them into two halves of an earthen maw with jagged teeth slamming shut hard enough that it would have crushed them into a stain that mixed with the crumbled stone heap left behind. Soft, quick footsteps reached Kiba's ears before Hinata came into view amidst the falling gravel. Now recovered, she had her palm chambered and was getting ready to deliver a gentle fist strike through his unguarded back and straight to the heart. However, the killing blow never reached as Jirobo twisted his body and used Naruto as a tool once more, literally swinging him like a bludgeon to knock her down. One down. Jirobo's burly fist then came down with the intention crushing her, a killing blow that she was only spared from by the presence of the Rock Lee. Having tossed her out of the way with one hand, he took the blow with his left forearm braced above his head in defense. "Tough one, aren't you?" "You have no idea," Lee said through gritted his teeth as the force backing it was enough to rattle his bones and crater the ground beneath his firmly planted feet as it transferred through. He then twisted his raised arm, grabbing the Sound Shinobi's arm before he could pull back and then delivered the other fist into the Sound Shinobi's chin. The crashing of bone on bone was loud enough that Kiba could hear it even if he didn't have sharpened senses, evidence that the blow had been a magnitude stronger than the last one. He'd opened one or two of his 8 gates then. The look of surprise that dawned on the stout shinobi's face as his head jerked back from the blow was short-lived as the second strike came from the same fist driving itself into his gut, leaving him to half buckle under it. Before a third blow could catch him off guard, he tensed the muscles in his cursed seal-reinforced body. Flesh that buckled before had become a wall that could weather the hit as he then tore his arm free of the grip Lee had and thrust out his palm to smash in his skull. Lee avoided by sliding his foot out and twisting his body, bringing his leg up to deliver a leaf crescent kick. The side of his foot slammed into the side of Jorobo's face before he followed up with a snap kick using that same foot. The heel of it was driven into the Earth user's throat hard and fast, leaving him to jump back while clutching it. Those kicks should have snapped his neck and collapsed his trachea, Kiba couldn't help but think as the Earth user extended his hand again, and the subtle sound of shaping stone was followed by earthen spines jutting out of the ground as Lee lunged. Reflexive training saved him as he then spun in the air until his legs were facing forward, spreading wide to brace against the necks beneath the stone tips, and then anchoring himself with chakra to bring his forward momentum to a stop before jumping back to where Hinata was. Just how tough is he? I hate using this many techniques since they make me hungry, Jorobo said before he dropped Naruto to the ground and made the rat seal, which caused the earth to encapsulate him in a horizontal coffin of stone that dragged him down into the ground. That made retrieving Naruto and getting away now an impossibility until they could dig him out. On the other hand, it meant now they could go all out without the risk of killing him in the crossfire. Now, Akamaru. Kiba and Akamaru both lunged from their perch. Throwing themselves into a spin, they used their chakra as a propellant to increase their rotational speed as they cut through the air from the right and left. Bearing claws sharpened to the limit, the passing fangs drew across as they intersected against a broad bulk of the sound shinobi and tore him apart. Shriek. Yet, all that resulted was a shrill and deafening screech. Rather than being torn asunder, Jorobo's flesh had turned impenetrable somehow. The sharp claws couldn't cut through it before he lashed out with his thick arms and batted them both aside with contemptuous ease. Kiba's world flashed and his consciousness flickered as he was knocked out of his spin and sent head first towards a wall. The only thing sparing him from a fatal collision was the fact that Rock Lee had gotten behind him and grabbed him, while Hinata had done the same for Akamaru, who'd been knocked out of his transformation. He brought his hand to his head, where he found pain pounding at his skull as blood ran down from it as well. We had him just now, so what the hell happened? It appears that his skin has changed somehow, Lee said before Hinata shouted out a warning, and he pulled Kiba out of the way as more rock pillar spears erupted from the ground like oversized weeds that would run them through and hang the corpses from their edges. Look at how the light reflects off it. Kiba fought against a swimming feeling that encompassed his head and wiped the blood from his eyes to see that Jorobo's skin had gained edges and picked up a somewhat glass-like appearance. Almost like the flesh had hardened to being gemstone. The scent he could pick up over the blood was more like stone as well, like he'd blended in with the floor. He's doing something with earth chakra, Hinata explained as she cradled the unconscious ninja pup in her arms and jumped into the air in a bid to escape as the ground beneath her turned into a bog. He's cycling it from his body into the ground and then back into him. I think he's copying the properties of the ground around him, refining it, and then applying it to his outer skin, AHH. Kiba shouted as her words turned into an abrupt scream when hands formed out of the mire and stretched out to grab her legs, pulling her down into it and below the surface along with Akamaru. No. Release them. Lee demanded before leaping towards the one responsible. He spun in the air to build momentum and then brought his leg around for a vicious leaf whirlwind right against the sound shinobi's head, hard enough to take it off his shoulders. The blow was only deflected on impact, sliding off without making him flinch. Undeterred, Lee then unleashed a barrage of kicks and punches from the different angles that continued to do nothing against a rock armor until Jorobo slammed his fist into the ground and forced up a flat slab of earth even faster than before between them. He then punched it and the slab exploded outwards in a rain of rough chunks and stone dust. Lee jumped back to avoid the debris spray, only to see that he was about to be overtaken by Jorobo, who'd catapulted himself forward by having an angled wedge of earth launch him shoulder first into Lee. Unable to dodge, before he touched down, Lee attempted to shield himself with both arms again. But the moment it connected he was plowed through the wall. It broke upon his body before burying him beneath the rubble as Jorobo then stepped away, leaving Kiba to stare at the motionless hand that was left visible as the sound shinobi turned to him next. Then his rage broke. You bastard. He shouted with raw hatred as broke into a sprint before throwing himself into another fang over and launching towards Jorobo once more. It was nothing more than futile and desperate attempt at lashing out. Pain blossomed as he was swatted like a fly and hit the floor hard, left cradling his ribs and struggling to get back up. "You weaklings were more trouble that you were worth." Jirobo reached down and grabbed the Inuzuka by the throat with his bare palms, the only unhardened place on his body, before lifting him into the air with a single arm and holding him there. "Now for a snack, before I hit the road." The moment he said that, Kiba felt something ripping the chakra out of him. Painfully. Tearing it out of him in such an agonizing way that it felt like countless thorns were being pulled from his insides through his throat and into his assailant. Suppressing his desire to scream from the pain, losing what little air he still had in his lungs, he gritted his teeth with hot tears streaming down his face as clawed at Jirobo's face in a frenzy. Again, it did nothing to change what was happening. Am I going to die like this? Strength left his body from his chakra being devoured. His lungs burned from the lack of air. And seething disgust bubbled in his gut at both his enemy and himself. Am I going to die without being able to do anything again? It was no different than the time with Kabuto. Not only had he been unable to stop the traitor, but he'd been unable to do anything to harm him. Since then he and Akamaru had practiced non-stop to get stronger, increasing their rotational speed, matching their timing, working on their combination technique, and yet, he couldn't even scratch the enemy in front of him. Let him go. The declaration was followed by a burst of chakra and a jerking motion as the arm holding him buckled. The drain of chakras ceased for a single moment. It was long enough for Kiba to lash out with his foot and kick himself free once more. The Inuzuka gasped like a buried man breaching the surface of the ground as he landed on his hands and knees, panting. When he looked up, he found Hinata standing in front of him in a gentle fist stance. Akamaru was pressed against her chest with the other arm, and relief flooded Kiba's body. If he had to guess, she'd forced her chakra out violently to displace the bog around her and then propelled them out of it. Jirobo looked confused more than anything as he stared at his arm. "You got through my rock armor? Even if you've hardened your body, it's only because you're using earth chakra to anchor those changes," she said. "If I force my chakra into you then I can knock it out of place and your body will go back to normal. Just because you got in a lucky shot doesn't mean you're going to get another one." Jirobo's arm hardened to become unyielding like crystal once more. "I'm going to enjoy draining every last drop of chakra you've got in you for making me work up an appetite." Kiba tried to move to stop him. He couldn't let her fight that behemoth on his own, especially not while having to hold onto Akamaru. Not after watching her nearly die. But having his chakra drained had left him unable to muster the strength. He needed to mold more chakra. Enough so that he could fight again. Enough for a decisive attack to kill the monster of an enemy in front of them. Before he could kill them. Kitamaru POV. Kitamaru bit down a swear as he tilted his head to the side, narrowly avoiding having his third eye blinded by the viper-like, two-fingered strike that came for it. His eyes and mouth were now the only unprotected part of his head. The rest of his body was nestled safely behind a hardened layer of sticky gold that was tethered to his skin by the adhesive underside, allowing him to move freely. If there was a weakness, it'd be that the exterior layer was thin, not even an inch in thickness. But he didn't need it to be able to stop a hit hard enough to shatter stone. After all, Neji wasn't stronger than Kitamaru with the boons of the cursed seal. Yes, he was much faster in terms of both speed and reflexes. That proved deadly when combined with a precise and efficient combat style like the gentle fist. But if the chakra couldn't get through, then what? Abandoning brute strength for the sake of speed was fine. But only if every hit managed to strike the skin and damage the organs beneath it. Against substances like his sticky gold, it was futile. Regardless, Kitamaru was forced to acknowledge that the match was still decidedly against him and wanted nothing more than to retreat for two primary reasons. First, close combat wasn't his specialty. Not that he couldn't handle himself at close range since 6 arms proved to be better than 2 any day of the week. But it wasn't where he specialized compared to the others. He was the sniper. Hidden out of sight and lurking in the distant shadows, he read the movements of his targets and awaited the perfect moment to strike. Kitamaru would then hit his mark without fail, regardless of how fast they were. Second, he was on a timer. The objective had been completed on his end. The Jinchuriki was captured. He needed to escape before reinforcements arrived, and so he was only looking to make an opening before that happened. To that end, 2 arms lashed out with hastily constructed sticky gold weapons to occupy Neji long enough to finish using his other 4 to make the hand seals necessary for a pair of summonings. Kitamaru then slammed his hands on his shoulders so that the summoning script scrawled across the makeshift armor as he leapt back, spitting out a tethered web flower that bloomed into a sprawling net to capture him. The Hyuga moved to cut down the web flower with a slash of his 2 fingers, chakra dancing on the tips, that was sharpened to a point, only to instead dodge with a roll the moment he noticed that the webbing had electricity coursing through it like a conduit. His Byakugan eyes then focused on the fist-sized spiders that now rode on the top of Kitamaru's shoulders. One had a black body and yellow stripes, with 4 green eyes that illuminated as sparks danced from the hairs covering its body. The other was a deep reddish color that had a black mark on its abdomen that looked wavering like a flame, with matching eyes. Both had a developed chakra network and possessed already converted chakra within them, lightning in the first and fire in the second. Time to burn. Kitamaru's cheeks then swelled before spitting out a larger glob of spider silk from his mouth like a cannonball. At the same time, the red spider spat out a venomous-looking fluid that slammed into the mass. Fire bloomed the moment it touched the webbing, spreading over the expanding web to become a sticky and burning death trap. Neji used a body flicker, a burst of speed necessary to escape it. He reappeared on the vertical trunk of a nearby tree that he clung to with one hand and foot laced with chakra. Then he had to move again as the yellow spider turned its rear towards where he'd gone and then began to use its hind legs to launch urticating hairs that carried an electrical charge towards him. The moment they touched the section of bark he'd been on, the scent of ozone and flickers of electricity made it clear getting hit by one would be debilitating. Neji was forced to take refuge behind the tree, his frown deepening as he watched Kitamaru try to flee again. That was when a living black cloud blotted out the light of the sun from above. A whirling maelstrom of parasitic insects filled the air with endless buzzing, forming a perimeter that wouldn't allow for the sniper to escape. The swarm circled around him and closed in to form a dome, within which they began to consume him utterly. "You're late." "My apologies," Shino said with a slight incline of the head as he landed next to the Hyuga. "It took me a moment to get rid of the golem and hatch enough Kakechu, but the 2 are being escorted to safety as planned while the others are making arrangements should he get past us. Though I am concerned that Hinata will do something rash in her current emotional state before we can retrieve her group." He trailed off as flames came to life, blinding heat forcing Neji to close his eyes and peer through his eyelids. It blazed out in a circle that surrounded them, incinerating the swarm that had closed in. Even the tree they were hiding behind was consumed by the flames, forcing them to abandon cover as the red spider from before was now much larger. It had donned the flames-like armor molded in its shape. Expanded to where it towered over them as the air around it combusted to immolate everything within range. The only exception was the sniper and yellow spider, hidden beneath it in a cocoon of solidified golden webbing. "Focus on the enemy in front of us," Neji told him as he focused on the red spider nestled within the flaming exoskeleton's core. "If he gets away then it'll all be for nothing." With a shriek, the red spider lunged for the flies trapped in its parlor of flames. Then its core was shot out mid-flight by a vacuum shell of chakra that smashed through the flaming exoskeleton. Its body met with the unyielding trunk of a scorched tree and painted it with visceral fluids before its remains sank to the ground behind the tongues of flames. Besides, Neji continued, lowering his hand that was racked with a pins and needles sensation from the vacuum palm. "The others will be fine with Lee looking after them." Lee POV. Lee's consciousness slowly came back to find that a fog had settled into place within his mind. His thoughts were blurred and he felt a heavy weight pressing down on his body. "Am I buried under something?" A rumble shifted some of the rubble, causing a lance of pain to stem from his arms. It shot straight into his mind and caused the fog to evaporate. "Right, I was fighting that person who kidnapped Naruto, and he'd been won over. Overpowered while under the influence of the Gate of Healing. Few in their age group could claim to have done so, and the Earth user had to be only a few years older at best." Lee tensed the muscles in his arms and recognized the extent of the damage from the type of pain. He'd fractured the bone from where he'd taken that hit, but none had broken. He then forced himself to move despite the mild ache that permeated his body from opening the second gate, pulling himself out of the rubble to see that Hinata was fighting alone while Kiba was on the ground, face scrunched in concentration and eyes screwed shut. As she darted around and tried to get to his back, only to retreat several hops back before earthen spines jutted out of the ground to chase after her, Lee observed that it was a poor match-up for her. She was doing admirably, but he was simply able to control the battlefield better. That meant she was constantly on the defensive and was ultimately unable to do enough raw damage fast enough to get through his guard. Knowing that, he reached deep and reopened the first two gates, along with the gate of life. It felt like he'd opened a sluice gate holding back boiling water that rushed throughout his body and washed against his muscles, bones, and skin. His heart raced, the languor brought about by unconsciousness melting as blood coursed through his body at an accelerated rate, dyeing his skin its hue. Lee then kicked off the ground that cratered from the force as it rocketed him forward, whereupon he reinserted himself into the battle with a dynamic entry. The extended foot caught Jirobo in the face, knocking him to the side and stopping him from grabbing Hinata. Landing in front of the stout shinobi wearing hardened skin as armor, he told Hinata to fall back. "Leave this to me." "Still alive, huh?" Jirobo tilted his head side to side with an audible crack. "Good, I hate wasting food." So, even 3 gates isn't enough to deal with him. In light of that conclusion, Lee wrenched open the gate of pain. Its namesake flooded his body and chakra started to bleed out as it oversaturated everything it possibly could. He gritted his teeth to bear with it and balled his right fist before he closed the distance. "You're telegraphing now." Jirobo crossed his arms to block the incoming hit and prepared to counter. Then there was a crashing sound as the air itself trembled from the impact, displaced from the sheer force as unbreakable skin met with pure power and muscle. The solitary blow knocked him off his feet and his rock armor fractured, hardened skin sporting fissures that ran all the way down to his elbows. Whatever arrogance he'd displayed previously was wiped off his face as Lee then delivered a second hit with his leg to the side of Jirobo's head. The world flashed as he was knocked off to the side, bouncing off the ground once before he dug his fingers into it to slow himself and regain control. He came to a stop on top of his own bog and was left coughing blood. What incredible durability, Lee couldn't help but think as he lowered his leg. The throbbing pain from where he'd struck was evidence of that. It seemed that he needed to push himself to the limit if he was going to break through that rock armor entirely, so he tensed his body and prepared to unlock the gate of limit. Fear crossed the sound shinobi's face as he watched the air around Lee start to waver and the ground cracked, leaving him to make the bird seal. The mire that made up the bog came to life under the earth flow spears technique, oozing earth shaping into tendrils that wove around Jirobo with serpentine motions before spreading out. They cut through the air as they condensed at the tips and hardened into stone spears that would impale him from different angles. Then the sound of slithering earth was replaced with a roaring gale as Lee forced open the 5th gate and was greeted by the unforgettable pain of hard work. The ache of needles piercing from the inside of his muscles as they threatened to tear themselves apart. The familiar taste of saliva turning into steam that slipped through his teeth as it left his mouth. The unyielding burning from the inside out by the flames of youth. Chakra was no longer contained to his body, instead forcefully billowing out as a spiral. It mixed with the aura of green vapor that loosely shrouded his figure, the sweat evaporating from his rising body heat. Straining the muscles in his legs as the sinuous spears neared, the ground around Lee caved in entirely as he disappeared from view. Then the tendrils all came apart in an instant and Lee abruptly stood at the side of his opponent, fist-chambered. The sound shinobi's face tightened as he thrust his own massive fist out to intercept when Lee's cocked fist shot forward. The strong fist, backed by more than half of the 8 gates, met with an Arat fist, backed by a cursed seal's 2nd stage and rock armor. The air quaked and a fearsome shockwave rippled out, forcefully displacing the remaining mud and loose earth as the hardened layer of outer skin on Jirobo's arm was blasted away, while the sleeve of Lee's shirt was ripped asunder. NGH. Lee winced as a shooting pain ran through the knuckles of his fist and down his forearm as they regained their footing on the solid ground. He could feel the bones beginning to fracture. But he ignored the pain as he reeled it back and brought his left leg around for a kick towards his opponent's head. Jirobo guarded his head with his right arm tucked against it, still covered in the rock armor. The sound of shattering stone mixed with the snapping of bones as the impact with Lee's shin broke through the hardening, scattering fragments of it in the process. His face contorted in pain as he then retaliated with his left knee, intending on caving in Lee's chest before his foot even finished coming down. Instead of crushing Lee's heart through his ribsage, the knee met with Lee's left forearm as he hastily used it to guard from the fatal blow. Blood slipped out of his mouth as the force still shot through the limb, snapping the bone and into his abdomen. The pain was so intense that he wanted to scream out, but the green beast bit down on his own lips to the point of bleeding, so that not even a peep escaped as he balled up his right fist up again as tightly as possible and brought it to bear against his enemy with all his might. The air ruptured as the punch was driven directly into the sound shinobi's abdomen, shattering the rock armor as the fissures spread through the rest of it, covering his body while his eyes went blank and his mouth was left gaping wide. Then the momentum launched him into the rock face opposite them, hitting it hard enough that the entire room shook. It came crumbling down on top of him, and the stone dust obscured their enemy from view, while what looked to slivers of light pierced the veil. NNHH, Lee's fingers quivered as the gates closed, and the fist he'd been holding came undone. Blood seeped through the rips in his flesh along the knuckles, pain from the muscles that had torn under the force of his own strike, leaving him barely able to stand. "He's not down yet," Hinata shouted abruptly from far behind him. Then Lee felt himself being grabbed moments before stone lances speared out to impale him where he'd stood. Kiba had barely managed to pull him to safety near the wall, where Hinata and aroused Akamaru were as the silhouette in the stone dust wavered on the opposite end. Jirobo was still alive. Still standing, but not unharmed. He was huffing, with blood spilling down from the corners of his mouth as what was left of his rock armor crumbled down onto the ground. His right arm was destroyed, broken bones jutting out of the orange flesh as it hung limp. The sound shinobi gave them a final, hateful look before he slammed his remaining fist into the ground hard enough that it was upturned. The entire room quaked and tremored as a slab of earth that stretched the length of the room shot upwards and crashed into the high ceiling above. Just like that, they were split off from the other side of the room that continued to shake with fissures spreading out. "He's raised the coffin Naruto was sealed in," Hinata warned. "It looks like he's going to run with him through the opening and leave us to be crushed on this side of the chamber as it comes down. Like hell he's getting away," Kiba declared as Akamaru climbed onto his head once more and there was a plume of smoke that washed over them. Before it could even dissipate, a two-headed wolf that towered above them by thrice their height emerged with its lips peeled back and saliva running from parted fangs that were long like swords. Its coarse fur bristled. It howled with a bone-shaking roar before spinning violently enough that the wind threatened to blow Lee away as the wolf shot towards the bulwark. The massive drill of fangs and claws then met with the solid earthen wall in a thunderous crash, exacerbating the shaking as dust filled the room and threatened to choke them. "This way!" Hinata shouted as she grabbed his arm and pulled him straight ahead while the ceiling began to come down on top of them. Rubble fell from above while Lee was effectively blind, relying on her to guide him. Then she flung him ahead of her and there was a rush of fresh air. Lee hit the ground and opened his eyes to see that untamed woodlands was around him. The sight of trees that rose tall beneath the sky filled his view. Their roots hale and hardy as they dug into the surrounding dirt. The only exception was a furrow that had been drilled into the ground. It ran in a straight line, carved out by that last attack until the pair's combination technique split, and they were panting to the right and left of where it came to a stop. There, at the base of an overturned tree that was now part of a mound of dirt and shredded wood, was what was left of their opponent. Dead. Hinata then broke through the opening, gasping as she stumbled out with Naruto in her arms. Lee's body shot up at that moment to catch her before she fell and lowered them both to the ground gently. Dust billowed out of the hole that Kiba had made as the chamber they'd been in finished collapsing in on itself. Fighting for breath as exhaustion and pain began to ravage his body, Lee struggled to get the words out. Is he? He's just out of chakra," she said, looking down at Naruto's unconscious face as her eyes went back to normal. "But we did it. We saved him." End of chapter 55. Chapter 56. Kitamura's breathing was heavy as the discharge of electricity left the air around him thick with the scent of ozone while he continued to run. It was a strong smell that was almost suffocating given that most of his face was still behind the sticky gold mask he wore to shield it. But considering how the little, illuminated dots within the perception of his third eye were snuffed out en masse, it was worth the discomfort. The moment his fire spider had been killed, he'd reassessed the threat level of his opponents once more and opted for a fighting retreat. Killing the Hyuga on his own was still plausible, despite the discovery of him possessing at least one ranged attack. But the Aburami's presence was a bigger threat, given how his techniques worked at range and without line of sight. Where is he? His third eye continued shifting its gaze wildly as he tried to make out where the next attack would come from when it spotted the chakra network abruptly running parallel to him. Without a moment's hesitation, he spat out a lance of sticky gold towards the Hyuga as he shot forward. Neji slid low under it, allowing the lance to pass over his head as a burst of chakra coming from his rear foot propelled him forward. The sniper jumped up to avoid the incoming strike, extending one arm up towards the tree branch further ahead and expelling webbing to tether himself to it, while the electric spider sent electricity down the broad net that he spat out next. The Hyuga still managed to slip out of range and then turned to deliver a vacuum palm that smashed a crater into the bark of the tree that was in the path of the attack, having missed Kitamaru as he pulled on the webbing tethering him above to swing away. Using the momentum of his swing, he intended to continue fleeing when the line abruptly snapped at the anchor point. It left Kitamaru with just a moment of unbalance as his third eye made out the insects gnawing at it. There were patches of them clinging to the surroundings at points where he would try to tether a new web line meant to reduce his mobility without being concentrated in a single spot, whereas the woodland floor was turned into a carpet of marching parasitic insects. Landing on his feet, he found the Hyuga rushing into the offense again and brought his topmost arms up to guard his head as a pair of fingers came in to strike his exposed third eye, intent on blinding him. The debilitating strike was warded off successfully, but his counterattack consisting of the other four arms delivering hammer blows to Neji's unprotected body was artfully dodged as the Hyuga retreated in time for a shadow to be cast over Kitamaru's body. Moving as one, the parasitic insects that had been marching on the ground lunged like a tidal wave to bury him. The electric spider discharged its lightning chakra once more to kill the amassed insects, tongues of electricity shooting into their tiny bodies and bursting them apart from within when something attacked him from the right. On reflex, Kitamaru brought his arms up to have the gauntlets of sticky gold intercept whatever it was when a crunching sound reached his left ear along with a spray of visceral fluids. His summoning had been impaled, falling to the ground with one of his own discarded arrows wedged into it. Then his vision flashed. Something with a lot of momentum and weight came crashing through his defense on the right, the abrupt impact shattering the makeshift gauntlets under the sheer force. The world whirled past him until a tree broke across his back, leaving him embedded in the cratered trunk. GHRK, streamlets of blood ran from the corners of mouth and dripped down to the ground, which was peppered with splintered wood and fragments of gold as Kitamaru pulled himself out of the cratered tree. His armor was broken, and his right arms were now nothing more than masses of meat that were laced with pain. What the hell hit me? He fixed his third eye on the one responsible and witnessed a rotund Akamichi's arm retracting back to its normal size while he was panting fiercely on his knees, sweat dotting his face and his arms trembling. His chakra levels were practically non-existent. He wasted what was left of it on that all-or-nothing gambit to break through his armor, leaving the Hyuga to advance a final time while compressing a massive amount of chakra into his palms. Instinctively, Kitamaru knew that it would be a killing blow and made to dodge it, only for his blood to run cold as he learned he couldn't move his body at all now. His third eye looked down to see that a foreign chakra was interwoven with his shadow from the direction of where the insects had been. It had been a coordinated attack from the beginning. The constant pestering meant to keep him from noticing as the others from the party worked to cut him off in a multi-sided ambush. The tenebrous fingers born of his shadow came up to his neck to further immobilize him. Then they clamped down over his mouth, preemptively stopping him from spitting out anything to prevent the fatal attack. Unable to move or speak, he could only watch as the Hyuga moved in to finish him. At least they won't be able to savor the kill for long. That was the last thought he entertained before the two palms met his chest and then discharged. There was an infinitesimally small moment of unbridled pain as a molten sensation passed through his body. Then nothing. Jiraiya POV. Even as the last member of the Sound 4 fell in battle, the plans that were put into motion continued to spiral onwards. To the northwest of the village, past the outer walls of the outskirts, where the hardy greenery consumed the earth, there lay a cavern where dangerous artifacts and forbidden techniques were locked away behind a gateway interwoven with a potent seal. The sealed hall was a location known to few, and for good reason. Jiraiya darted towards that location with a number of other jonin in tow: Kakashi, Gai, Asuma, and Kurenai. They were acting in place of Anbu, who had been scattered between ferreting out the other compromised root shinobi, removing the detonation tags, securing the Sanjin Chuariki, and relocating the civilians just in case. Sanada had been sent to recover the spare sealing scroll that he'd been working on since learning that Orochimaru could still come back from the moment they'd captured the first member of the Sound 4, and it was his hope that he could contain them a second time before she had to fight her grandfather and granduncle. They arrived to find that the unsealing was already underway. The wooden coffin housing the reanimated bodies of the first and second Hokage was placed within a complex sealing array had been etched into the ground around it, several shinobi sitting in a circle that was contained within a 4 violet flames formation barrier to prevent any outside interference. Recognizing the array's function and seeing the sealing script on the coffin beginning to illuminate with a sinister radiance, Jiraiya immediately tried to stop it. Using the boar and tiger seals to shape his earth chakra, he slammed his hand onto the ground and used chakra control to spread it out. The land around the mountain's entrance was immediately transmuted into a swamp, dropping the 4 violet flames formation as the shinobi holding it together were dragged beneath the adhesive surface and ruining the cohesion of the sealing array. But it was too late. The array had done enough to interfere with the chakra absorption process, which drew from the perpetual chakra of the reincarnated shinobi to fuel the gravity field within it and keep the 2 inside immobile indefinitely and the redundant processes he'd put into places. The result was a cascading failure, every function of the seal being undone, and what followed was an explosive release. "Fall back," Jiraiya warned as he used a body flicker to get as far up and back as he could an instant before massive, gnarled roots violently tore through the wooden confines of the casket-like spears and snaked through the swamp despite the adhesive nature. They impaled surrounding rock faces and spread into a massive network that swallowed up everything around them in an instant. He touched down onto the root-strewn foothold that encompassed a large perimeter of cleared woodlands, everything that once protruded above the ground level crushed and mowed down with the exception of 2 figures that stood in the center of the destruction. The dust and dirt cleared as the wind blew to reveal the first and second Hokage standing there, their gaze on him. Even as a mass of hair rose seamlessly from the ground behind them and then shriveled to reveal Kurenai and Asuma. While Guy landed to their left and Kakashi to the right, they only had eyes for the Toad Sage. Then the 2 spoke as one. "For us to meet like this again after only a few months is a rare thing, isn't it, Jiraiya?" That voice. The unmistakable voice that he'd hoped to never have to hear again. "And you haven't changed at all. Still hiding away and letting others do your dirty work, Orochimaru. Ah, well. You'll understand if I decide to savor the destruction of the village vicariously through its founders this time. I believe it to be more poetic, in a sense." A chuckle that didn't belong to those 2 sent chills down his spine as wood clones of the first Hokage began to emerge from the fibrous roots until the second Hokage made a hand seal. Then darkness abruptly enveloped everything within the Toad Sage's sight. A world of pitch black where only the Snake Sanin's voice could be heard. "You'll find that they'll be a bit more of a challenge this time." Gaara POV. At the same time, in the isolated domain, where the host of the one-tailed raccoon dog had been placed, a roar that was mixed with a desperate cry was let loose. Gaara stumbled about haplessly, his bare feet splashing over the puddles of blood that were peppered with broken ceramic and splinters that dug into them. Yet that pain was nothing compared to the grating at his sanity as his body was swallowed by the sand of his gourd, which had broken down into a whirling maelstrom of fine grains. They clung to his flesh like hot ashes, encroaching over the right side that began its monstrous transformation for the first time in months. He had been reading when the power to the facility went out and the scent of blood first reached his nose. The oozing, intoxicating liquid had permeated his life since the moment he'd killed his uncle to save himself. It was the proof that he had lived and, to the beast that claimed itself to be his mother, a sacrifice. Then a guard was thrown through the door, his body breaking it open as he tumbled onto the ground lifelessly, and blood ran freely from a gouged-out heart as more men filed in, one of them even carrying his gourd that had been hidden away. Gaara couldn't resist what happened next. His chakra had been sealed away in order to keep him from resisting while in captivity, so he had no means of defending himself when they stormed in and forced him down to the ground. The next thing he knew, they'd applied something to the inhibitor seals that had been placed on him to repress the tailed beast's influence, essentially throwing open the gates holding it back, and their lives had been the first to be snuffed out as it began to climb through. Ha 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 ha. A laughter that haunted Gaara's nightmares passed through the fangs that had formed on the right side of his face as the beast spoke. "Finally. I'm going to be able to kill again. Nuo." Gaara said through pained groans as he struggled to maintain control as the appendage that was composed of sand lashed around, slamming into the wall of the room and leaving it cratered. I won't let you control me again." It was a valiant struggle, but also a vain one, which was evident as he lost control of his legs and tumbled to the ground. Sheer force of will slowly gave way as the sand covered his left leg and arm, crawling over his skin and wresting control away despite his best efforts. Soon even his screams were stifled as the sand warped the lower half of his face into that of the tailed beast and closed in on his remaining eye. "All right, now it's time get my revenge." The Achibi rose to his stolen feet and looked down at his limbs, flexing the fingers. "And I'll start by blowing this village to pieces along with Kurama." That would pose a bit of a problem for me. The overtaken Jinchuriki lashed out against his will towards the source of the voice, the limb stretching as the fingers closed together and were shaped by the sand into a sharpened point. The limb impaled the cloaked figure through the chest, the point of the spear embedding itself into the wall. But there was no resistance or blood at all as he continued to speak. Especially since we still have to find out where the Sanbi reformed after Yagura outlived his usefulness. The moment the tailed beast's monstrous eye and Gara's remaining eye were fixed onto the single exposed one of the man in the mask, the world shrank. The tailed beast that had proudly reveled in the intoxicating scent of blood found himself slipping into a spiral of crimson stemming from the red eye hidden behind the mask. Then the masked man walked forward until he was looking down at the Jinchuriki, leaving both the host and beast within to feel small and helpless as he towered over them. "But I think you'll be useful in your own way in the future," he said as that spiraling red eye shone like an ominous, dying star as it robbed them of their consciousness and drew them in. Naruto, POV. As those events transpired, a clone of Naruto felt the weight of reality asserting itself once more as he was liberated from the limbo that was stasis within a sealing scroll. In order to practice with the technique that imitated the fox cloak, whereupon the host was shrouded in power, in order to keep up with the stronger threats they faced, Naruto created a shadow clone that would do nothing but focus on converting the half of his chakra it received into yang chakra as slowly and in as refined a manner as possible. Then, when it reached its peak in terms of the amount of chakra it could hold by the end of the day, that clone would be sealed away for practice the next day. As such, the clone thrummed with yang chakra beneath his flesh as he opened his eyes to the sight of Konohamaru stealing from him. The boy was soaked in sweat, panting frantically as he then ran out the door while holding the sealing slips that contained the divine beast masks without a word, leaving a translucent ribbon in his wake. The now very confused Naruto clone only registered it as belonging to the priestess mask when the thin cloth looped around his head and a voice that was like a gently chiming bell rang out. "Leave him." That clone ran from the academy and doesn't have much time before he disperses. It was Karen. The clone could feel that much from the touch of her mind on his. "I'm going to pass along some memories to you. I want you to disperse yourself afterwards so that the original gains the memories along with the chakra." "Karen, what's going on?" asked Naruto's clone. The answer came in the form of memories. A rushing torrent of memories that weren't his. A flood of information filtered through the ribbon and then dumped straight into his mind without pause. The clone found himself not in his room, but in a dark chamber between a stout boy and one who possessed 6 arms as they watched Hanko being used to bring Orochimaru back to life in front of them. She was lying on the ground unconscious and bruised, beaten after having finally been caught in return for letting the pair of Uzumaki escape, with Kabuto looking over her battered body and tampering with the cursed seal on her neck. The moment he was done, Anko's eyes snapped open and her body sat upright, spine going rigid and pained screams coming out of her mouth as the 3 Tomo pattern on her neck connected with one another to form a small dark circle. Then the screaming intensified as a massive serpent tried to burst free from the narrow opening, only being constrained by black thorns from the evil sealing method around the cursed seal. The thorns dug deep into the snake's flesh to keep it tethered down as she realized what was happening and tried to stop its escape, her teeth clenched and eyes screwed shut. The way her face twisted in agony with hot tears spilling out spoke volumes of how desperate she was to stop the return of the person she hated most in the world. But it all amounted to nothing. The serpent's girth expanded and tore through the thorns, causing it to burst free of her body entirely and leaving her to stare in hatred as its gaping maw opened wide. Then she was swallowed whole. The serpent compressed down over her body like a flesh suit, reshaping until it took on Orochimaru's form. From there the rest of the memories played out. The orders to capture Naruto and Karen, the intention of using the reanimated Hokage and Gaara as weapons of mass destruction, and the plans to bomb the village's key points. How they watched them at the birthday party, planned on kidnapping the pair, and then attacked the girls, only to end up being captured. As the memories stopped flowing, Naruto's clone was left breathless on his knees as he regained his sense of self from the memory injection. "We're already working to stop them," Karen said preemptively. "The Hokage has sent people out to track down the explosives, and the Sound 4 are dealt with from what I can feel. The other people at the party are safe and I'll have Suzaku and another divine beast head towards where the original you are now. Take Suzaku to the sealing R&D building." "Hold on," he said, not wanting to return to the original just yet. Not without knowing about the 2 things she didn't mention. "What about those undead Hokage? And Gaara?" Jiraiya-sama is there along with a number of other jonin, so I'm sure they'll be fine. As for Gaara, she trailed off for a long and pregnant pause that left the clone growing even more worried. I felt the tailed beast's chakra leaking out and told the Hokage, so he sent some people over. But another chakra signature just appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared with him before they could arrive. I don't know if it's because dealing with the Sound 4 coming after us made them change their plans, or if that's how they got the Uchiha out of the village in the first place without anyone noticing, but he's gone. The news left him frozen in place for a moment when an ear-splitting shriek and panicked voices drew his attention outwards. He ran out the door and bore witness to the source of the discord, a massive water dragon arsing down from the sky to smash into the ground in the distance. The undead second Hokage's work, no doubt. The clone made to head towards the battle there, but before he could the ribbon around his head tightened to hold in him place. Karen, let me go. Those are unkillable, Hokage-level revenants with infinite chakra, Karen pointed out. You'll only get in the way. Let the others seal them away again. But, please, Karen begged him this time. I just watched one person die for us to get back here safely. If you go there, it'll just be a wasting their sacrifice on top of everything else. This isn't a fight for you to get involved with, so please come back to me. He hesitated, realizing that she had to watch what happened personally when the memories were first taken from the head of the pair she and Sakura captured. That meant she had to witness the faint hope she'd been clinging to that Anko could be saved after sacrificing herself snuffed out. And, as if to rub salt in the wound, doing so had provided the very thing needed to bring back one of the people she feared the most. Returning to her would at least give her peace of mind. That was what she was looking for now more than anything. For the original, who'd been kidnapped, to return to her so she didn't lose someone else. But, clone or original, Naruto couldn't leave things as they were. Not like this. Not after losing Gaara and Sasuke. Not after Sakura had gotten hurt. Even if he couldn't go there in person, he wanted to at least do something rather than leaving it all up to the old man and the rest. Okay, but first let me send out the divine priests to help them. I'll do it, Karen insisted. Jiraiya-sama had the Hokage give us access to all of the masks and the chakra that was stored away before they removed my cursed seal. So, please, go back to the original and wait for Suzaku to arrive. Reluctantly, the clone did as she asked and, poof. The original Naruto gained the memories as strength flooded his body, filling in the void left behind after having the rest of his chakra drained. Alert and aware, he opened his eyes to find that he was being carried with one arm over the shoulder of a familiar person. Kiba? Took you long enough to get up, the Inyazuka said, sounding as battle-worn as he looked with the smell of sweat and blood reaching Naruto's nose. It was clear from how dirty and beaten his clothing were, along with tears in his flesh and bruises around his neck, he'd been put through a real fight. Ah, you've awakened at last, Naruto-kun. Rock Lee said as Naruto got his feet under him and gently pulled away. He was further ahead, being supported by Hinata, her Byakugan active, with a makeshift sling supporting his left arm. Akamaru was riding in her hood and yipped at his awakening as well. And you're positively glowing. Yeah, that's, Naruto couldn't find the words to express how he felt nor face them. It was clear they'd fought for Naruto's freedom, which only punctuated the guilt he felt since he was relatively unscathed. He didn't want them to get hurt protecting him. He didn't want anyone getting hurt to protect him. That was part of why he'd pushed himself to become stronger so he could protect everything precious to him. Yet, he had been the only one to be captured. Karen and Sakura managed to hold their own. The others had managed to survive as well according to Karen. But he had to be saved, letting the others shed blood for his sake. The very thought left him clenching his fist and grinding his teeth as he looked down to the ground. He couldn't let it end like this, hiding away with Karen while the others did the fighting. Even if they sealed the first and second Hokage away again, it wouldn't solve anything in the long run. Not as long as Orochimaru was still around to do it again for the third time. He had to be stopped now. Or else the next time he showed his face, he'd likely be wearing Sasuke's body. And after him someone else. To avoid death, he'd keep transferring his soul from one body to the next, discarding them when he was done like he was a god. His thoughts froze then as an epiphany dawned on him. The ceiling R&D building was where Karen wanted him to go. All the masks from the Forgotten Temple were there, and they had access to them all given the state of emergency. Including the God of Death's mask. Naruto-kun, Hinata called. It looks like two of your mask creatures are coming. He looked up to see that the Suzaku had arrived first. The vermilion bird perched itself on the ground in front of him waiting for him to climb on top. Kinja followed, slithering along the ground and weaving through the trees until it formed a circle around them. "Get on Kinja," Naruto told them. "It'll carry you to the village. Find the others who were at the party and tell them that I'm sorry it came to this. I'll make it up to them one day, I promise." "What about you?" Hinata asked as he mounted the vermilion bird. Naruto took one last look at the three of them. They'd risked their lives to save him. If he wasn't willing to do the same, he couldn't call himself a shinobi of this village. "I'm going to go put an end to this once and for all." End of chapter 56. Chapter 57. Ancient wood cracked and splintered. Thriving canopies that obscured the sky collapsed. The verdant growth and fertile soil that surrounded the village hidden in the leaves was being upturned and crushed without care. A grand, serpentine wood dragon roared loud enough to shake the very air. Announcing its presence to all within the distance, it was joined by a choir of three others. Each head of the quartet was large enough to carve out a massive gorge, yet all of them were connected to a central body compassed to countless vines and stems wrapped around bark, a multi-headed abomination. The engine of destruction that had been erected by the first Hokage's revenant was moving southeast in order to overrun the village. There would be nothing more disheartening to those who fought tooth and nail for the village's sake to know that it would be toppled and trampled underfoot by the very same person who'd helped establish it. That was why Orochimaru had set him loose to do so. The fact that they had several minutes at best before it reached the village walls was only because the sealed hall was established far enough away to prevent any of the dangerous items that had been stored there from damaging the village should they go off. The second Hokage's foresight at work. Had they been allowed to escape and get closer with the village unaware, then the village itself would have been ground zero for its arrival, and the casualty count would be immeasurable. It was the only consolation Jiraiya could find as he twisted his body, avoiding a wooden stake that would have gouged out his heart as it shot forward like a thrown spear. Fabric ripped, a tear in his clothes from where it had narrowly missed. But he managed to bring up his right hand, cradling a spiraling sphere of chakra in its palm, and violently smashed it into the wood clone that stood in his way. The clone broke to pieces, no longer hindering his advance to reach the two revenants that stood at the base where the heads met on the central body. But where one was destroyed, another was born as the supple bark split open like a womb and pushed it out of the abomination. There was a trade-off to the fact that it could create so many. They were simplistic creations, watered-down facsimiles of the revenant that could only attack the enemy in front of them, whilst the original controlled the abomination. But simplistic was enough to get the job done as they extended their arms that warped and shot out sinuous sylvan spears. The toad sage clicked his tongue, mentally counting the seconds as he threaded the strands of his hair with partition chakra. Strengthening, lengthening, manipulating them until they wove around his body to form a cocoon that was as hard as steel. The wooden spears scraped themselves raw as they tried to crush him, when piercing his makeshift armor failed, weaving around the white hair like serpents, only to then be severed by wind-infused blades and a lightning-wreathed kunai. Taking to the front, Asuma and Kakashi both dismissed their attacks in order to suck in deep breaths of air, one laced with wind chakra and one kneaded with fire chakra. Then they exhaled as one. Roaring, wind-fed flames devoured the backside of the sylvan dragon, blackening it as the wood clones were reduced to scattered ashes as the stream of fire seared the air on its way down to the revenants. Meeting their efforts were shadow clones of the second Hokage, with two of them forming a separate set of hand seals before releasing their own collaboration technique of wind and water. A whirling surge met the rushing flames before they could completely cross the distance, and the intense heat met the deluge. A violent hiss gave birth to thick, billowing clouds of steam that expanded until the hot winds whipped at their clothes and obstructed their view. Then a third clone broke through the veil from above, hands chambered as lightning cracked between clenched fists. Jiraiya's white mane unwove as they were thrown like a flurry of arrows, allowing him to leap back, while the other two broke to the sides. It proved to be the right call, to avoid rather than entrust that his steel-like hairs would shield him against that nature of attack. The arrow-shaped lightning chakra constructs were all aimed for the space where their hearts had been and pierced through the broad bark that had already begun to shed and replace its charred surface. That same clone followed up by forming a large sphere of water as he fell and held it out in their direction. The surface undulated wildly before serpentine heads shot out towards them, a set of aquatic tendrils whose ends split apart to reveal fangs that were congealed enough to tear into stone. They came lashing out for the three, driving themselves into the sylvan footing and tearing out chunks as they continued to give chase after them, leaving no time for hand seals or rest. Dynamic entry. Mike Guy then made his appearance with a diving kick that crushed the maws of one of the aquatic beasts, his nunchaku drawn for use against the others as they whipped around to try and ensnare him, along with another unit of wood clones from beyond the veil of thinning steam. But in a whirl of strikes from the twin fangs and a burst of speed that parted the steam, he tore through them all in an instant, including the shadow clones. "The path is clear. Then do it now," Jiraiya ordered. At the prompt, Kurenai abruptly shot up from behind the two revenants and into the air. One kunoichi became a dozen, flinging more than 100 kunai down on them that had explosive tags attached. A bombardment that would reduce them both to oblivion for a time. The second Hokage brought his hands up to counter, water spiraling in the palms, before turning into a raging torrent that swept up to the sky and overwhelmed the rain of kunai and copies all at once. There wasn't a body to be found among them before his hands abruptly ended bound behind his back, his head forced to face the sky and brought to his knees. The first Hokage's revenant was likewise bound at the hands, straining to move as something invisible held him in place. Empty space behind them was abruptly filled as Kurenai reappeared where she'd first emerged, the external genjutsu shrouding her from sight melting away to reveal both her and flashing steel that glinted in the light. Wires were bound around the revenants, reinforced with chakra and pulled taut within her hands. She extended her chakra through her feet, subverting that of the first Hokage in a small section, and then phased both hands into the surface of the dragon before leaving the wires inside as she pulled away. "Now, Asuma." Wind chakra compressed in the soles of Asuma's feet rocketed him forward faster than eyes could track. In an instant he crossed a distance and cut through the two revenants in passing, leaving their bodies to break open as Kurenai threw hastily drawn sealing tags into the openings and Jiraiya prepared to activate them. By forcing the tags within their bodies as they reformed and then having them activate, they could hopefully render them immobilized internally with no way of them removing it by themselves. Of course, his optimism of being able to end things there died when Kakashi shouted, "Get back now. He's going to explode." Given it was insight granted by the Sharingan, Kurenai leapt back with a body flicker to put as much distance as possible between them. Her black hair expanded at an explosive rate as she landed next to Asuma and wrapped both of them up as it hardened, adding to their defenses. It was probably all that saved them as the second Hokage exploded with a thunderous detonation that swallowed up the empty space between them and sent the cocoon flying over the edge to where the broken trees laid in ruin. But it was safe to say that their attempt had failed. 4 more shadow clones of the second Hokage sprang into existence as the pair reformed. Now each one was a ticking time bomb that contained a fraction of the second Hokage's chakra capacity, likely with the amount of chakra translating to the strength of the explosion. And since the second Hokage would never run out of chakra, he could make more of them whenever they were destroyed with no consequence. If the first Hokage had been turned into the architect of an engine of destruction, capable of unleashing numerous wood clones that could release countless fast and flexible wooden spears, then the second Hokage became the source of an endless supply of suicide bombers. One of them alone could bring an army to ruin within minutes. Together, they could wipe the Leaf Village off the map. As the shadow clones began to move towards them, the sound of slicing air reached Jiraiya's ears from behind. Instinct drove him to move, to dodge, even as the series of colorless waves passed above where his head had been and into the shadow clone barrage that was intent on self-destructing. They cut into the clones, dissipating them into nothingness as the colorless wave was dyed with the chakra compassing them, and then boomeranged back past the group who looked to see the 3 waiting vessels. The northern and southern monks floated in the air in the distance, one hand held in front of their masks in prayer, while the black-robed reaper hovered in front of them with its scythe perched across its shoulders and hand near the base ready to swing again. The monks then crossed their staffs across one another, and sealing script etched itself beneath the abomination before violet light erupted to form a massive barrier that encapsulated it, locking away everything within it. The Leaf Shinobi were then forced out of the barrier, the very space itself rejecting them. Landing onto the rocky outcropping to the left of it, Jiraiya watched the abomination lash against a barrier with every head it could until a translucent ribbon reached out to touch his mind and Karen's voice echoed within. "I've informed the third Hokage of what I've felt going on. He's begun an evacuation of that section of the village while getting ready to mobilize a number of shinobi for the suppression of the first and second." "Good to know," he said as the Sylvan abomination continued to thrash against a barrier, joined by high-pressure water streams that tried to punch through it and wooden spikes from clones that continued to be birthed. The cracks that were starting to show within the barrier were patched right away as the 2 monks continued to repair it, streamers flowing from their staffs into it. The Reaper also let loose another series of vacuum waves that cut into the different clones and robbed them of their chakra, dispersing them before feeding it to the monks to fuel their efforts in a cycle that bought them precious time. But Jiraiya doubted it would hold up for long. The thing was too big, and Orochimaru was controlling the revenants, reveling through their eyes at the mayhem. If he didn't have a way out of such circumstances, then he wouldn't be as big of a threat as he was. Indeed, storm clouds began to form at the ceiling of the barrier with abrupt haste and let loose a downpour of rain cascaded down the sides. That rain, it's washing away the chakra holding up the barrier from the inside out, Karen warned, even as the Reaper began to cut away at the clouds, only for them to quickly reform. Both of the Hokage and the clones are using the technique, and the Reaper won't be able to get rid of them. The barrier won't last long at this rate. We're going to have to burn this thing to the ground all at once if we're going to have a chance of getting out of this with the village intact, Jiraiya said as he clasped his hands together and began concentrating while they still had a reprieve, knowing that he couldn't delay it any longer. He had to call out the Toad Sages if he was going to deal with this thing. Be a dear and pass on a message to the old man for me, will you? Karen POV. They're starting to mobilize now, Karen said, the priestess hovering behind her. Dozens of translucent ribbons flowed out from her construct body and steadily faded until they vanished just short of the walls, becoming intangible and invisible until the ends neared their target and the chakra compassing them solidified once more. Good, the Toad Sage answered. And how's the princess coming along? She's on her way now. Rubbing her temples to quell the pounding in her skull, Karen teetered on the edge of mental exhaustion and alertness as she stretched her mind's eye to its limits. Locating individuals amidst a crowd with the necessary chakra based on how their bodies died it and adding them to the connections she had with the divine priestess, on top of using the spiritual link to relay instructions for assisting on the battlefront to the divine priests, was taxing. But it was necessary right now. Shaking her head, she then felt out the third Hokage's chakra and the ribbon tethered to it. Their minds connected. Hokage-sama, I haven't been able to find the person you wanted me to. I can't tell if they're missing or dead, I'm afraid. That's unfortunate, but I understand, he answered. What of the others? The Akamichi and Naras are moving in for the suppression. She felt the movement of their chakra types, even if she didn't know their faces. Techniques dyed chakra and those of the Akamichi and Nara clan were as day and night due to how yang and yin chakra were the roots of their techniques from what she felt. The earth and fire specialists splitting up into 3 groups as well. Child, my strength wanes, the priestess warned through their spiritual link. Her ribbons had been extended in too many numbers for her to maintain the same level of functionality. She needed more chakra. Forgive me, but the priestess is running low on chakra due to the number of ribbons I've extended, Karen said after making her report. Unlike the others, who the Reaper could keep fueled and strengthened, the priestess was too far from them. Thankfully, she had access to the chakra that had been taken from her for the surgery and stored away. She just needed time. You've done enough, the Hokage said. The Yamanaka are getting set up as we speak. They'll be able to relay information between the divisions now that everyone is getting into position. Rest for now. She didn't refute him as the ribbons began to dissipate. In the first place, she was just filling in the gaps until the main forces finished their sortie, given the abruptness of all of this and how unprepared they were. It was the least she could do in lieu of the sacrifice made on their behalf. Once the last of the ribbons was gone, the priestess was reduced to her mask and set down 4 on the seal that housed the remainder of her stored-away chakra. Karen then closed her eyes and breathed out a shuddering breath as the different chakra signatures that flittered within the scope of her consciousness, colors and textures clashing, swelling, and sputtering out, shrank onto the undead first and second Hokage. Orochimaru's chakra signature was there, anchored into them intricately enough that she couldn't see a method of separating them. It was like a thread that stretched across a vast distance, far enough that it was easily out of her range. Not a trace of Anko's could be felt within what she could feel. Nothing can be done about that now, Karen told herself. Depressed. She sighed softly and then tried to sense if there was anything else about them that could be used to help. Leaving aside the fact that they should be dead, how their chakra was being replenished went against the norm too. There was no molding of spiritual and physical energy, but rather it was like when the reservoir of chakra within them was emptied out, it was instantly topped off by a larger source. What that source could be was lost on her, since a corpse shouldn't be able to provide the physical aspect of chakra. She supposed a soul would provide the spiritual aspect since it was essentially what provided the body its consciousness, but it was almost like an automated process. The color of their chakra never changed to where she doubted it could be theirs either, not that she had a reference for their chakra from when they were alive. There was never an excess or shortage. Never a deviation or fluctuation that naturally followed human error. Maybe it was due to the nature of the technique itself that brought them back, but Karen couldn't say for certain since the ritual itself wasn't known within the memories she'd gleaned. Then she shifted her focus back to other chakra signatures of importance. She could feel Sakura's chakra signature was located in the hospital, now cleared top to bottom for any trace of explosive tags given its importance. Shizune was with her at the moment. Sanada was now proceeding to the battlefield to assist against a first and second Hokage as well. As for Naruto, he was closer now, and that was honestly a relief. When she felt how faint his chakra signature was at first, a wisp that flickered faintly and teetered past the outskirts of the village, she had been on the verge of having a panic attack. But soon he was going to be with her again, safe and sound. She sprung up as Naruto's chakra signature reached the opposite side of the door, rushing to reach the room. To reach her. The thought made her feel so happy that the moment the door opened she grabbed hold of him with open arms and brought him into a hug. "I was so worried about you." "Sorry," he told her softly. "It's fine now," Karen said, holding him against her and feeling the warmth of his flesh for the first time since they'd parted. She didn't want to let him go, but when she tightened her grip his back tensed, as though recoiling in pain. So she pulled back and looked over his body, where she spotted the blood on his clothes. "You're hurt." "It's not my blood," he assured her, catching her hand as it reached down for the stain on his clothing. His cerulean eyes were folded in, never meeting her own as he looked off to the side. "Karen, do you still have that chakra that they took from you before they removed the cursed seal?" "It's over there." She was slightly taken aback by the sudden shift in his tone as he created a shadow clone that took hold of Suzaku's mask as he wandered over to where the chakra was stored away. "I saved most of it in case it was needed, since the Reaper can siphon off chakra and pass it around. Given that the first and second Hokage have a seemingly infinite amount, it could keep the other divine priests functioning perpetually." She tried to go over to him, but the clone obstructed her path and shook his head. The original went over to take the chakra for himself, which was fine as far as she cared. What worried her was the fact that he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Naruto, did I do something wrong?" "That's not it," the clone told her, his fingers brushing her cheek as he looked to where she'd been struck before by the twins. The bruise had been numb to the point where she could barely feel his touch there. Karen abruptly felt self-conscious when she took in her own appearance. Even though an imperfect replacement set of glasses had been provided to her, she'd spent most of her time focused on getting through the memories of the twins and then sending out the ribbons to get in touch with everyone. She didn't stop to think that he would mind her appearance, the bruise, split lip, and grime from the chase and fight covering her clothes. "Give me a minute and I can fix myself," she told him, backing away and starting to dust herself off. Healing up her lip and bruise would take a bit longer, but she could do so relatively hastily if she borrowed some of the chakra once Naruto was done topping himself off with it. "That's not it," the clone said, stepping forward to keep in step with her. Like he didn't want her out of arm's reach. "You got hurt, while I've barely got a scratch on me. You, the others, everyone else, it's not right." Karen couldn't help but feel, perhaps ashamedly, relief that it wasn't her appearance he had an issue with. Naruto was just concerned about everyone else's well-being. "But that's not your fault. None of this is. It was Kabuto's fault first and foremost. Leaving him alive was what led up to all, from Anko's capture for resurrecting Orochimaru to ruining Naruto's birthday. It was meant to be a day of celebration for him, and now it was tainted even further by all of this, the loss of the Uchiha, who Naruto and Sakura were attached to, their guests being injured, his kidnapping, etc. The memory of today would stick no matter what. But Karen knew she could make it right the next time. They just had to get through this first, and then they could go from there together. And, as if to punctuate that thought, a delicate, intimate sensation was placed upon her lips. It was a kiss from Naruto to her. Instantly her mind came to a grinding halt. The fact that it was a shadow clone didn't register so much as the fact that he was pressing his lips against hers, taking the initiative, and catching her off guard. The soft feel of his kiss swept her mind away beneath the feverish heat that began to swallow her up from the point where they were joined. Flustered, her face took on the hue to her hair as the blood raced in time to her pounding heart as he pulled away. The phantom sensation of the kiss lingered until he embraced her tightly with all his strength, as if he didn't want to let her go, even if the world tried to pull them apart. And then, With a tremor in his voice, he said 5 words that would shatter her world. "Karen, thank you for everything." Karen felt like she'd been stabbed in the gut the moment she heard those words. She had heard them all before months ago during the last crisis the village faced, along with the kiss and the embrace that she'd given the clone back then. They had been to both express her feelings and distract him before she took Bayako and ran away. Chains burst from her body to impale the clone holding her at bay and then reached out to bind the original. But it was too late as the god of death's mask slipped onto his face. In the end, she could only hate that she didn't see it coming as he collapsed onto the ground right before her eyes. Because, even if he loved her, he loved this village and the people within it just as much, if not more. It didn't matter if it was one person being injured or hundreds dying, he wouldn't sit back and do nothing from the sidelines, no matter how much she begged. He would sacrifice everything for their safety. Even if it meant leaving her alone. Naruto POV. The moment the mask touched his face, Naruto felt the world around him splinter like fracturing glass as his perspective on the world was challenged. Then it shattered. And he was left plunging into darkness. No sound reached his ears. No light graced his eyes. No air touched his skin. No taste found his tongue. No smell reached his nose. An empty void deprived of the ordinary senses, leaving only his consciousness as, "I'm going to go put an end to this once and for all." A memory rippled within the void above him, growing distant. Left behind as he continued to fall. One of many that followed as he watched the life he lived before now be left behind as he continued to plunge deeper and deeper. He bore witness to his vow on Hinata's blood during the Chunin exams, the death of Haku, that set the path he wanted to walk as a shinobi, the betrayal of Mizuki, that lead to the reveal about housing the nine-tailed fox. Meeting Teuchi and Aoyama for the first time. Meeting the third Hokage for the first time. Memories that were impactful, moments that defined his life were playing out and growing distant until everything went black. Naruto, from now on, you're going to face a lot of pain and hardship. But be true to yourself. Have a dream and have the confidence to make that dream come true. Words from someone he couldn't know. With eyes closed and too young to see, there was no vision. And with infant ears only a handful of them registered. But he could tell they were the words of someone not long for this world, desperately trying to say so much in so little time. His hand moved as he tried to reach for that memory, only for it to slip from his fingers as he felt a heavy pressure slam into him from behind. Like he'd fallen into the water from up high enough that it was solid. It rattled his consciousness and shook apart the foundation that formed who he was as more memories came. A great beast releasing a blast, only to be deflected and form a waterfall before it was forced to heal. A pact between two clans in the hope of peace. A war raging, lives lost endlessly despite the misery it brings. A continuing cycle. Unlike before, where they'd been crystal clear, these memories were jumbled. Foggy. Fragmented. His mind could barely perceive a fleeting moment with any solidity as his ego began to break down and dissolve like salt submerged into water. Is this death? Naruto wondered as lifetimes he couldn't fully grasp were passing by. More and more of his body had vanished. He tried to resist, but there was nothing he could do. There would be nothing left at this rate. Am I dying without being able to help the others? Naruto continued to vanish. Disappearing more and more as even those memories grew distant. Asura, I entrust the future of this world to you and your descendants, until everything stopped as that single statement reverberated throughout the depths. A single memory that was unusually clear. A crystallized desire that would persist no matter how much time passed. Born of a promise to uphold an idea. Ninshu must not fade from the future of this world. The moment that uncannily familiar thought crossed his fading mind, he came face to face with an ethereal figure made of chakra. Nothing but an outline and a pair of unwavering eyes that held that same idea and refused to let it fade away, no matter how much time passed. The figure reached out and touched Naruto's forehead, and a jolt ran, though his mind, before he was shunted back up. Within seconds he breached the surface of wherever it was he'd fallen and gasped, taking the cold air into his lungs. What that? Naruto murmured, trembling as he rose to his feet. He was whole once more. Looking around to see that he was at the tree line of a dark forest of some kind. Behind him was a shadow-cast corridor of trees that seemed to stretch so far back that even the ghost flames that loitered in two neat rows to form a path couldn't cast enough light to reveal what was at the end of it. And in front of him was a woman sitting in a field, alone. She was curled up next to a small altar with candles surrounding it. Long red hair obscuring her downcast face. Hair that he had only seen in pictures to this day. Naruto sucked in a sharp breath. His feet moved him forward, drawn to her. He got close enough to hear that she was mumbling as well. Something about wanting to see someone desperately. That voice, it was one within the fragments of his memories. One of the first that ever reached his ears when he was too young to process it. Hearing it brought tears to his eyes as he uttered the words he never thought he would. Mom?" Red hair shifted as the woman looked up to reveal that she had violet eyes. Eyes that went wide when she spotted him. Her breathing hitched as she rose to her feet. "Nah, Naruto?" He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Why yeah. That's me." She ran over to him, coming to a stop within mere inches before falling to her knees. Lithe hands reached out slowly for his face, only to stop before coming into contact. As if she was hesitating out of fear that she was dreaming. Or that the reality was more terrifying. Even so, she braved it. A tender touch to his cheek left tears to well up in the corners of her eyes. Instinct gave way to her embracing him wholeheartedly, feeling the warmth that painted his soul against her body. "You're really Naruto, aren't you?" He nodded and asked her the same. And you're my mom, aren't you? My little Naruto." Her voice came out hoarse, hands holding him even tighter until the soft, safe embrace coaxed him into wrapping his arms around her back and returning the embrace. "How did you get here?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I was falling, and my memories were playing out right before my eyes. Memories that weren't exactly mine, but they felt familiar. Then there was someone who pushed me out, and I ended up on a path here. That shouldn't have happened unless." Kushina pulled back as realization dawned on her face. "You're still alive?" "I think so." He didn't feel dead, but he wasn't sure how that was supposed to feel given what just happened. Then he looked around the field but found it devoid of any other presence. A lonely place that held no one else. Had she been here since the day he was born? "Where are we?" "This is purgatory, Naruto." Kushina looked behind him to see the path there. The yellow ghost lights flickered. "Did you put on the God of Death's mask?" "Yeah," he answered. "We found the temple and learned about what the masks could do. Not just me, but another girl from our clan named Karen. We learned about you and Mito. Then some things happened, so I put on the mask and wound up here." Frowning, Kushina looked back to him. Then to the ground, tightening her hold on him for just a moment. Then she forced herself to pull away, turned him around, and started to push him out. "You need to go back the way you came, while the path is still there." "But I don't understand," he said, turning around and bracing himself so he couldn't be pushed anymore. "What's going on?" "Naruto, in order for the mask to work it uses your chakra to open the path to this plane and shunts your soul here," she explained. "At the same time, it also calls the God of Death here so that you can converse with it. It passes judgment on your motives and then, if you pass, it becomes one with you, and then the mask pulls you back into your body for a time. Do you understand?" "You mean, it's like a reverse summoning and a summoning all in one?" "That's close enough," she said. "But the fact that it's not here and you saw those memories means that something went very wrong. And if the process isn't complete then it won't automatically return you to your body. So you need to go back while you can, before whatever chakra is keeping the bridge from your body to this plane dries up and you'll be stuck here." In other words, it was only half done at best. If the mask wasn't removed it would continue to drain away the chakra being pumped into his body until there was nothing left. Then his organs would fail, his body would die, and the bridge would close. He would be trapped in purgatory. Still, even knowing that, Naruto shook his head. "The first and second Hokage, they've been raised from the dead. Now they're attacking the village. That's why I can't stop now." Kushina's eyes folded in at that. "What do you mean?" He explained it as best he could and as fast as he could. About how they were raised from the dead and being forced to attack the village, as well as how people were likely getting hurt even now. That was why he put on the mask and why he needed to have the God of Death to stop them. In the end, Kushina looked torn between pushing him to go back down the path and his words. This was, after all, her son. Her baby boy who she only had minutes to hold in her arms before she died. It had been more than a decade since she ended up here, tethered by her regret to see him grow while waiting to be reunited with Minato. She didn't want him to remain long enough for the path back to his body to close, not when he still had a full life to live. But, even so, she was also a kunoichi of the village. The wife of the fourth Hokage. Death didn't change that. She kneeled again and looked him in the eyes. "Naruto, most people don't get a second chance. Are you sure this is what you want? No matter the cost? Naruto could only imagine Karen right now, standing over his body. But he could also imagine Kakashi and Jiraiya fighting. He could imagine Sakura being in the hospital and the others who were being hurt even as they spoke. I still have to do this, no matter what. You really do take after your father, don't you? She sounded both happy and sad as she muttered those words, rubbing his hair. Then she reached down to his abdomen and closed her eyes. Then I'll fill in that gap. You can do that? He asked. Your father sealed away a part of my chakra inside of you that night. Since I helped him make the seal's design, and you're still tethered to your body for the time being, I can pull it out from here and use that to summon the god of death here, though. She trailed off, not finishing what she was going to say before Naruto felt a stirring in the pit of his stomach. Like a gaping hole opening up as the seal appeared on top of his clothes. He felt a lot pressure pushing against it, threatening to leap out until her hand pressed against it. Then the rattling of chains could be faintly heard before the pressure faded, and her hand sank inside of him for a moment. This feels weird, Naruto admitted, having no clue what was happening. I know, but put up with it for just a little longer. Your father and I were meticulous when it came to this seal, and circumventing it without getting rid of the safeguards he put into place or the key isn't easy. After a moment of silence, she opened her eyes and then changed the topic. You said you met a girl from my clan, didn't you? Are you close? He blushed as he scratched his cheek at the question. You could say that. Seeing his expression brought a smile to her face. What's she like? She's not weird, is she? No, she's great. He thought about all the time they'd spent together. It brought a feeling of happiness to his chest. Her hair is like yours and she can also make chains from her chakra or heal people who bite her, and she's really good at making seals. She's taught me a lot and helped me become a Chunin too. That's absolutely wonderful, Kushina told him before she pulled her hand back out. A vibrant sphere of pure yellow chakra was in her grasp. Guiding it to her chest, it came to rest inside of her. Then she began making hand seals as the seal on his stomach faded away once more. Naruto, you have a dream, don't you? Kushina asked as she made the snake, boar, and ram seals. The first 3 in the set. One that you're striving for no matter what? I wanted to be the Hokage so that everyone would know and respect me, he told her, rubbing the back of his head. I don't think anyone took me seriously until the Chunin exams though, and I didn't think it would be so hard being a shinobi. It was the same for me, she told him as she formed the next set of seals. Rabbit, dog, and rat. So many people laughed at me for it when I was a child, and I got so angry. I had lost my home, and even Mito passed away after I had to have the 9-tailed fox sealed inside of me. I wanted to take it with me when I died so that you didn't have to be burdened with it, but your father felt that you would need that power someday. Why? Naruto asked. He'd been left alone his entire life because of it until months ago. Why did his father choose to burden him with it instead? The night you were born, a masked man with a Sharingan attacked us and set it free, controlling it to destroy the village, Kushina explained as the third set followed. Bird, horse, and snake. He felt that you might need it someday and had faith that you would be able to control it. Is that so? Naruto reached down where the seal had been. Did his father really think he could do such a thing? Kushina stopped with the hand seals and looked him in the eyes. Seeing you like this was something that wasn't supposed to happen, but I don't regret having the chance to see you grown up like this. I'm happy that I'll be able to tell Minato his son followed in his footsteps when I see him again. A cold, heavy weight fell in Naruto's chest when she said that. His heart fell into his stomach. Those were parting words, the same as before. Only this time, he felt those words meant she was going someplace even further than the plane between life and death. Somewhere he wouldn't be able to follow. Mom. Then she clapped her hands together, as if in prayer. The chakra she'd taken into her was burned away, offered up to something distant. Immediately afterwards, an overpowering and primal fear that left Naruto paralyzed came crashing down upon them. The light was snuffed out and a deathly chill rolled in at the arrival of a being dressed in a white kimono that eclipsed the edges of his vision. Purple skin was framed by red horns and long white hair that had grown uncontrollably to the extent of meshing seamlessly with its clothes. Jagged, black teeth were bared, serpent's tongue slithering out. And with a tanto in one hand and the other wrapped in what looked to be prayer beads, its yellow eyes peered down at the very tiny humans beneath it. What happened next would haunt his nightmares for years to come as Kushina voiced why she summoned it in place of Naruto to bridge the gap where his own efforts had failed. It adhered to her request, but not without a steep price extracted from her in his place. And there was only one thing the dead had to pay with. But for Kushina, it was enough. So long as it ensured her son could fulfill his goal and reunite with her husband once more. It had to be enough. That was why Naruto still embraced death's outstretched hand through the burning tears in his eyes as it granted his request for power. End of chapter 57, and sadly end of story, no more chapters. According to fanfic page, last update was January 21, 2019. I assume the fanfic will never be completed unless a miracle occurs and the author returns. If someone managed to survive to this moment, please share your opinion on this fanfic and Karen in the comment. If you want, go to the link in description and write your review for the author. And that's probably all, see you and have a nice day.